The silver moon hung low over Whisper Creek as Josephine Reed stood alone on the auction block, her heart pounding like a frightened rabbit's. It was 1875, and the bride auction was the last hope for unmarried women who had nowhere else to turn in the unforgiving territories of Wyoming. Josephine clutched her tattered shawl tighter around her shoulders as the auctioneer's voice boomed across the dusty town square. Her auburn hair, once her pride, now hung in limp strands around her pale face. At 22, she was considered well past marrying age, especially in a frontier town where women rarely remained unwed past 17. "Next up, Miss Josephine Reed," the auctioneer called, his voice tinged with forced enthusiasm. "A fine worker, can cook, clean, and sew. Comes with her own trunk of belongings." The crowd of rough-looking men stared up at her with disinterested eyes. A few whispered and laughed. Josephine felt her cheeks burn with humiliation. This was what her life had come to, being auctioned off like livestock after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and a tarnished reputation from his drunken misdeeds. "Starting bid is $5, the auctioneer continued, his voice dropping slightly. When no one raised a hand, he cleared his throat. $3. Silence stretched across the square. Josephine's heart sank lower with each passing second. She had heard whispers that no one would want the daughter of the town drunk, but she had desperately hoped someone might see past her father's sins. $1. The auctioneer tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. Not a single hand went up. A tear slipped down Josephine's cheek before she could stop it. She would have to face the harsh reality that awaited unclaimed women, the workhouse in Cheyenne or worse. Just as the auctioneer was about to declare her unclaimed, the saloon doors across the street burst open. A tall figure emerged, silhouetted against the golden light from within. The crowd parted as the man strode forward, spurs jingling with each step. Dust swirled around his worn leather boots as he approached the auction block. Weston O'Malley had just ridden into town after 6 months on the cattle trails. His face was weathered from sun and wind, his eyes the clear blue of a mountain lake. A week's worth of stubble covered his strong jaw, and his dark hair curled slightly beneath his wide-brimmed hat. At 30, he had carved out a respectable living as a cattle rancher, though few knew the demons he carried from his past. The crowd fell silent as Weston stopped before the auction block. His eyes traveled up to meet Josephine's, and something in that gaze made her breath catch. Without taking his eyes off her, Weston raised a gloved hand and pointed directly at Josephine. "That one is mine," he stated, his voice deep and clear in the silence. Whispers erupted through the crowd. The auctioneer's face brightened. "We have a claim. Mr. O'Malley has claimed Miss Reed." "The bid is $20, Weston interrupted, reaching into his pocket and pulling out a fold of bills. "And we'll skip the bidding. No one else wants her, and I do." Josephine's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know whether to feel relieved or terrified. Weston O'Malley was known throughout the territory as a fair man, but a solitary one. His ranch outside of town was said to be one of the most prosperous, but also one of the most isolated. The auctioneer nodded eagerly, taking the money. "Sold. Miss Reed belongs to Mr. O'Malley." Weston stepped forward and offered his hand to help Josephine down from the block. His touch was surprisingly gentle as her fingers met his, though she could feel the calluses from years of hard work. "Do you have belongings?" he asked quietly. Josephine nodded, finding her voice. "A trunk." "It's behind the stage." Weston gave a curt nod. "Wait here." As he walked away to retrieve her trunk, Josephine stood frozen in place. Around her, the townspeople watched with curious eyes. Mrs. Abernathy, the baker's wife, approached with a sympathetic smile. "You're lucky, dear," she whispered. "O'Malley's got a good reputation. Keeps to himself, but he's honest. Better than ending up with old Jenkins or, heaven forbid, one of those miners." Josephine could only nod, her throat tight with emotion. Lucky was she. She had just been purchased like a piece of furniture. Weston returned, carrying her trunk effortlessly over one shoulder. "My wagon's this way," he said, gesturing down the street with his free hand. Josephine followed him silently, aware of the eyes watching their departure. The wagon was simple but sturdy, with a team of 2 strong bay horses waiting patiently. Weston loaded her trunk into the back and then turned to help her up onto the seat. "It's about 2 hours to my ranch," he explained as he climbed up beside her. "We should make it before dark." As the wagon pulled away from Whisper Creek, Josephine stole a glance at the man who now owned her future. His profile was strong, his expression unreadable as he focused on the road ahead. "Why?" The question escaped her lips before she could stop it. Weston glanced at her, then back at the road. "Why what? Why did you choose me? No one else wanted," she broke off, unable to finish the painful truth. Weston was quiet for so long that Josephine thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. "I need someone to help with the house." "And you looked like you needed saving." Josephine bristled slightly at this. "I don't need saving, Mr. O'Malley. I can take care of myself." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Is that so? Then what were you doing on that auction block?" She had no good answer for that. They rode in silence as the town faded behind them and the vast Wyoming landscape opened up around them. Rolling hills covered in spring grass stretched to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional copse of trees. "It's beautiful," Josephine said softly, almost to herself. Weston nodded. "That it is, most beautiful country I've ever seen." As they traveled, Josephine gathered her courage. "What will you expect of me?" she asked finally, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Weston's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "I expect you to keep the house, cook meals, and help with whatever needs doing, same as any ranch wife would. And," Josephine swallowed hard, "and as your wife," Weston's expression remained unchanged, but a muscle in his jaw tightened. "We're not married, Miss Reed." "And I didn't buy you for that." Relief flooded through her, followed immediately by confusion. "Then why, I bought your contract," he explained. "You'll work for me for 1 year to pay it off. After that, you're free to go wherever you please, or stay if you want, but that'll be your choice." Josephine stared at him, stunned. "You mean I'm not to be your wife?" Weston shook his head. "I don't take unwilling women to my bed, Miss Reed. Never have, never will." A weight lifted from Josephine's shoulders. Yet beneath the relief was a strange, unexpected twinge of disappointment that she quickly pushed aside. "Thank you," she said quietly. "Don't thank me yet," Weston replied. "Ranch work is hard, and I'll expect you to earn your keep." As the wagon crested a hill, Weston's ranch came into view in the valley below. A sturdy 2-story house sat nestled against a backdrop of pines, with a large barn and several corrals nearby. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with cottonwoods. Cattle grazed in the distance, dark specks against the green landscape. "Welcome to Whispering Pines Ranch," Weston said, a hint of pride in his voice. Josephine took in the sight with wide eyes. It was larger and more established than she had expected. "You built all this yourself." "Started with nothing but that small cabin there," he nodded toward a simple structure near the creek. "Built the main house 3 years ago, been adding ever since." As they approached, a dog came bounding out to meet them, a large black and white border collie that barked excitedly at their arrival. "That's Scout," Weston said, as he pulled the wagon to a stop before the house. "He's harmless, unless you're a cow that needs herding." Scout sniffed curiously at Josephine's skirts as Weston helped her down from the wagon. She tentatively reached out to pat the dog's head, and he immediately licked her hand in approval. "He likes you," Weston observed. "Good sign." Weston carried her trunk into the house, leading her inside. The interior was surprisingly spacious and well-built, though it clearly lacked a woman's touch. Everything was functional rather than decorative, with simple, sturdy furniture. A large stone fireplace dominated the main room, with a kitchen area to one side and a dining table to the other. "Kitchen's stocked," Weston said, setting her trunk down. Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. Mine's at the end of the hall. There's a washroom off the kitchen with a pump. Josephine nodded, taking in her new surroundings. When would you like dinner, Mr. O'Malley? Weston, he corrected. If we're living under the same roof, might as well use my given name. Then you should call me Josephine, she replied. He seemed to consider this, then nodded. Josephine, then. Dinner in an hour would be fine, nothing fancy, I need to see to the horses. After Weston left, Josephine explored her new home. Her bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a real bed, a luxury she hadn't enjoyed since, before her father's gambling debts had cost them their home. There was a small window that overlooked the mountains to the west, and a chest of drawers for her few belongings. In the kitchen, she found the pantry well stocked with staples: flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and preserved foods. There was even a small herb garden outside the kitchen window. Clearly, Weston O'Malley was not a man who let himself go hungry. Josephine set about preparing a meal from what was available: a simple stew with dried beef and vegetables, fresh biscuits, and coffee. As she worked, she found herself wondering about the solitary rancher who had claimed her. Why would a man like Weston, who clearly had the means to court a proper wife, choose to buy a woman at auction instead? And why tell her she wasn't expected to be his wife? These questions swirled in her mind as she set the table and ladled the stew into bowls. Just as she was placing the biscuits on the table, Weston returned, his shirt sleeves rolled up and his hands freshly washed. He stopped in the doorway, a strange expression crossing his face as he looked at the set table and the meal waiting. Something wrong? Josephine asked. Weston shook his head. No, just, been a while since I came into a hot meal I didn't cook myself. They ate in relative silence, the only sounds the clink of spoons against bowls and the occasional appreciative grunt from Weston as he helped himself to another biscuit. This is good, he said finally. You cook better than I do. Josephine smiled slightly. Thank you. My mother taught me before she died. When was that? 10 years ago, she replied. Consumption. It was just me and my father after that until he... She trailed off, the memory of her father's final disgrace still too painful. Weston didn't press. Well, you learned well. Tomorrow I'll show you around the place, introduce you to the routine. That night, lying in her new bed, Josephine listened to the unfamiliar sounds of the ranch, the distant lowing of cattle, the whisper of wind through the pines, and somewhere in the house, the solid footsteps of the stranger who had saved her from a fate she didn't want to contemplate. She had no illusions about her situation. She was not free, not truly. But for the first time in years, she had a roof over her head that wasn't at risk of being taken away, food in her belly, and the promise of honest work. It was more than she had dared hope for when she stood on that auction block. As sleep claimed her, Josephine's last thought was of Weston O'Malley's eyes, not cold as she had first thought, but guarded, hiding something deep within. Morning came early on the ranch. Josephine woke to the sound of movement downstairs and quickly dressed in one of her 2 serviceable dresses. By the time she made her way to the kitchen, Weston had already stoked the fire in the stove and had coffee brewing. Good morning, he said, looking up from the cup he was pouring. Help yourself. I usually have eggs and whatever's left over from the night before for breakfast. Josephine nodded and set about preparing a proper breakfast: eggs from the chicken coop Weston pointed out, along with some of the biscuits from the previous night, warmed on the stove. As they ate, Weston outlined her duties. House needs keeping cleaning, cooking, mending. Garden out back needs tending. Chickens need feeding twice a day. If you're comfortable with it, there's laundry and butter to be churned. I have a man who comes by 3 times a week to help with the heaviest ranch work, Miguel Sanchez. Good man. His wife, Elena, used to help with the house before they moved further out. She might stop by to show you where everything is. Josephine took mental notes as he spoke. The work sounded manageable, not much different from what she had done in her father's home before everything fell apart. After breakfast, Weston showed her around the property. The barn housed 4 horses his own mount, a powerful chestnut stallion named Thunder, 2 workhorses for the wagon and plow, and a gentle bay mare. "That's Daisy," Weston said, nodding toward the mare. "She's yours to ride if you need to go anywhere." Josephine's eyes widened. "Mine." "Well, for your use," Weston clarified. "You'll need to get around the property somehow." Beyond the barn were the chicken coop, a small smokehouse, and a storage shed. The vegetable garden was overgrown but salvageable, and an orchard of young apple trees lined one side of the property. "You've built quite a life here," Josephine observed as they walked back toward the house. Weston looked around his property with quiet satisfaction. "Took time, nothing worth having comes easy. How long have you been here?" 7 years, he replied. "Came west after the war with nothing but thunder and the clothes on my back. Worked cattle drives, saved every penny, bought this land when nobody else wanted it." "You fought in the war?" Josephine asked cautiously, knowing how some veterans refused to speak of their experiences. Weston's expression closed off slightly. "Union cavalry. That's all there is to say about that." Josephine nodded, recognizing the boundary he had drawn. "My father fought as well, never was the same after." Something flickered in Weston's eyes, understanding, perhaps before he changed the subject. "I'll be out with the herd most days. Back for midday meal when I can, always by supper. If you need anything urgent, fire 3 shots from the rifle above the door. I'll hear it." The days fell into a rhythm as spring deepened into summer. Josephine threw herself into her work, grateful for the purpose it gave her. She cleaned the house until it shone, tamed the wild garden into orderly rows of vegetables, and turned the plain meals Weston was accustomed to into something more flavorful and varied. Elena Sanchez did indeed visit, a warm, round-faced woman with a ready smile who showed Josephine the best way to preserve the garden's bounty for the coming winter. Under her guidance, Josephine learned to make jellies from wild berries and to dry herbs for both cooking and medicinal purposes. "You bring life back to this house," Elena observed one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. "Senor O'Malley, he is different since you came. Not so." She searched for the word. "Alone." Josephine busied herself with the beans she was snapping. "He's been fair to me." "I'm grateful for that." Elena gave her a knowing look. "There is gratitude in your eyes, yes, but something more too, I think." Josephine didn't respond to that. She couldn't deny that her feelings toward Weston had grown complicated as the weeks passed. She admired his work ethic, his fairness, and the quiet strength he carried. He never raised his voice to her, never made inappropriate demands, and always acknowledged her contributions with genuine appreciation. They still ate their evening meals together, and gradually, conversation became easier between them. Weston began to share stories of his travels, of cattle drives and the characters he had met along the way. Josephine told him about the books she had read, and the dreams she had harbored before life had dealt her such difficult cards. One evening, in late July, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in gold and purple, Weston asked the question she had been dreading. "What happened with your father, if you don't mind my asking?" Josephine was quiet for a long moment, her fingers worrying at the fabric of her skirt. "After the war, he turned to drink, started gambling, lost our home, our savings, everything. He owed money to half the men in town, made promises he couldn't keep." She swallowed hard. "The night before he died, he wagered me in a card game." Weston's head snapped toward her, his expression darkening. "He what?" "He lost, of course. Henry Jenkins, the man who one came to collect the next morning, but my father had drunk himself to death overnight. Jenkins claimed I was rightfully his, but the sheriff intervened, said there had to be a proper auction instead." Josephine gave a bitter laugh, as if that was more civilized. Weston's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles whitened. "That's why no one bid on you. They were honoring Jenkins's claim by staying silent." Josephine nodded. "Everyone knew, everyone except me, until it was too late. And this Jenkins he was at the auction." "Front row," Josephine confirmed. waiting for the auctioneer to declare me unclaimed so he could take me without paying. The sheriff couldn't have stopped him then. Understanding dawned in Weston's eyes, and then I rode in. Yes, then you rode in. They sat in silence as darkness fell and the first stars appeared in the velvet sky. Finally, Weston spoke again. I meant what I said, Josephine. When your year is up, you're free to go or stay as you choose, but you'll never be anyone's property, not while I draw breath. Josephine felt tears sting her eyes at the quiet vehemence in his voice. Thank you, she whispered. Later that night, as she prepared for bed, Josephine found herself lingering at her window, looking out at the starlit landscape. Somewhere out there, Weston was making a final check of the cattle before turning in. She wondered what it would be like to be truly his not as property, but as a partner, a wife. The thought sent an unexpected warmth through her that had nothing to do with gratitude. The summer days stretched long and hot as August arrived. The garden flourished under Josephine's care, providing fresh vegetables for their table. Weston worked from dawn to dusk, tending the cattle and making repairs around the property. Occasionally, he rode into town for supplies, always returning with something extra, a piece of fabric Josephine had admired, a book he thought she might enjoy, or a small luxury like real sugar candy. These thoughtful gestures confused and delighted Josephine in equal measure. She told herself he was simply being kind to an employee, but the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking told a different story. One sweltering afternoon, Josephine decided to take advantage of Weston's absence. He had ridden out with Miguel to check on the herd grazing in the north pasture to wash her hair. She pumped water into a large basin and carried it out behind the house, where a stand of cottonwoods provided shade. There, with only the sky as witness, she unpinned her long auburn hair and bent over the basin to wet and wash it. So absorbed was she in her task that she didn't hear the approach of hoofbeats until they were nearly upon her. Straightening quickly, water streaming down her neck and dampening her bodice, she turned to see Weston sitting atop Thunder, frozen in place at the sight of her. His eyes widened as they took in her loose hair, the way her damp bodice clung to her figure, and the flush that rose to her cheeks under his gaze. "I apologize," he managed, his voice rough. "Didn't mean to intrude, came back early because of the heat." "It's all right," Josephine said, fumbling for the towel she had brought. "I should have been more careful." Weston swung down from his horse, and for a moment, Josephine thought he might approach her. Instead, he cleared his throat and looked away. "I'll see to Thunder. Take your time." As he led the horse away, Josephine caught her breath, her heart hammering in her chest. The look in his eyes had been unmistakable desire, quickly banked but definitely there. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair, both of them carefully avoiding mention of their encounter. Weston excused himself early, claiming fatigue, but Josephine saw the tension in his shoulders as he retreated to his room. The next morning, Weston announced he needed to ride into town for supplies. "Anything you need?" he asked, not quite meeting her eyes. Josephine considered for a moment. "Thread if they have it, and perhaps some sugar. We're running low." Weston nodded. "I'll be back by nightfall." After he left, Josephine went about her chores with a distracted mind. The memory of Weston's gaze kept intruding on her thoughts. What would have happened if he hadn't turned away? The question both thrilled and frightened her. As promised, Weston returned as the sun was setting, his saddlebags laden with supplies. Among them was not only the thread and sugar she had requested, but also a small package wrapped in brown paper. "What's this?" Josephine asked as he handed it to her. "Open it and see," Weston replied, a rare smile touching his lips. Inside the package was a beautiful blue ribbon and a small bottle of lavender water. "I thought, for your hair," Weston explained awkwardly. The storekeeper's wife said women like such things. Touched by the gesture, Josephine ran the ribbon through her fingers. "It's lovely, thank you." Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them. Weston took a step closer, then seemed to think better of it. "I should unload the rest of the supplies," he said, turning away. That night, Josephine lay awake long after the house had grown quiet, the blue ribbon clutched in her hand. Outside, a summer storm was brewing, thunder rolling across the mountains and lightning illuminating her room in brief flashes. A particularly loud crack of thunder startled her, followed immediately by the sound of something large hitting the ground outside. Josephine hurried to her window to see that one of the old cottonwoods had been struck by lightning and had fallen against the corner of the barn. Without thinking, she grabbed her shawl and hurried downstairs. The rain had just begun to fall as she reached the porch, but already the wind was driving it in sheets. She could see flames licking at the barn roof where the tree had fallen. "Fire!" she shouted, rushing back inside to wake Weston, but he was already coming down the stairs, pulling on his shirt. "Stay inside," he ordered, grabbing his hat and rushing out into the storm. Josephine ignored the command, following him out into the rain. The flames were spreading quickly despite the downpour, fed by the dry summer hay stored in the loft. Weston was already leading the frightened horses out of the barn, while Scout barked frantically nearby. "Get the water buckets," Weston shouted when he saw her, "and ring the bell." Josephine ran to the well, filling buckets as quickly as she could, and then hurrying to the large dinner bell that hung by the house. She rang it vigorously, hoping the sound would carry to Miguel's homestead despite the storm. Together, she and Weston fought the fire, throwing bucket after bucket of water onto the flames. The rain helped, but the fire had too much of a head start. Just when it seemed they would lose the battle, hoofbeats announced the arrival of Miguel and 2 other neighboring ranchers who had seen the glow of the fire. With their help, they managed to contain the blaze to one corner of the barn. By the time the fire was finally extinguished, dawn was breaking and everyone was soaked to the skin and exhausted. "Thank God the horses are safe," Weston said, his face streaked with soot as he surveyed the damage. "The barn can be rebuilt." Miguel and the other ranchers departed with promises to return later to help with repairs. Josephine, shivering in her sodden nightgown and shawl, started toward the house, but her legs, weary from hours of hauling water, gave way beneath her. Before she could fall, strong arms caught her. Weston lifted her effortlessly, carrying her toward the house. "You shouldn't have been out there," he scolded, but there was no real anger in his voice. "You could have been hurt." "I couldn't just stay inside while everything you've worked for burned," Josephine replied, too tired to be embarrassed about being in his arms. Inside, Weston set her down gently in front of the fireplace and quickly built up the fire. "You need to get into dry clothes before you catch your death," he said. "I'll make coffee." Josephine nodded and made her way upstairs on shaky legs. By the time she had changed and returned downstairs, Weston had done the same and had coffee brewing on the stove. He had also laid out bread and preserved fruit on the table. They ate in companionable silence, both too exhausted for conversation. When they finished, Josephine rose to clear the dishes, but Weston stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Leave it. You need rest." "You worked harder tonight than anyone has a right to expect." Josephine looked up at him, suddenly aware of how close they were standing. "I only did what was necessary." Weston's hand moved from her arm to her face, gently brushing a strand of damp hair away from her cheek. "You did more than that. You fought for this place as if it were your own." "It feels like home," Josephine admitted softly. "More than anywhere has in a long time." Something in Weston's eyes shifted, the careful guard he always maintained slipping away. "Josephine," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've been trying to keep my distance to honor my word that I wouldn't expect, that I wouldn't—" She placed her hand over his where it rested against her cheek. "What if I wanted you to, for a heartbeat?" Neither of them moved. Then, slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, Weston lowered his head and brushed his lips against hers. The kiss was gentle, questioning, but when Josephine responded, sliding her arms around his neck, it deepened into something more urgent. Weston's arms encircled her waist, drawing her against him as if he couldn't bear any distance between them. When they finally broke apart, Both breathing heavily, Weston rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the moment I saw you standing on that auction block," he confessed. "You looked so proud, even in your fear." "Why did you really claim me that day?" Josephine asked, her heart racing. The truth this time. Weston's thumbs traced circles on her back as he held her. "I was riding past the auction when I heard what was happening, that Jenkins was trying to claim you through some gambling debt. It made me sick to think of a woman being traded like that. I was going to intervene regardless, but then—" He paused, a smile touching his lips. "Then I saw you. Standing there like a queen despite everything, and something inside me just knew." "Knew what?" "That you were meant to be here, with me." He pulled back slightly to look into her eyes. "But I couldn't just take you like that, not when you had no choice. So I made the offer of a year's work, thinking, hoping, that maybe by the end of it you might choose to stay. For me, not because you had nowhere else to go." Josephine felt tears well in her eyes. "Weston O'Malley, are you saying you've been courting me all this time?" A flush crept up his neck. "Poorly, it seems." Josephine laughed through her tears. "Not poorly, just carefully." Weston pulled her close again, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "You should rest. We can talk more when you've slept." Reluctantly, Josephine nodded. She was exhausted, her limbs heavy with fatigue. As she turned to go upstairs, Weston caught her hand. "Josephine," he said, his voice low and serious. "I meant what I said. When your year is up, you're free to choose. Even after this, even knowing how I feel, I won't hold you to anything." Josephine squeezed his hand. "I know, and that's why I'm already choosing to stay." The next few days were spent repairing the barn with the help of Miguel and the neighboring ranchers. Despite Weston's protests, Josephine insisted on helping, bringing meals out to the workers, and even helping with the lighter carpentry tasks. Something had changed between them since that morning after the fire. The careful distance Weston had maintained was gone, replaced by casual touches, shared smiles, and stolen kisses when they found themselves alone. They hadn't spoken further about the future, but Josephine could feel it taking shape around them, built on the foundation of mutual respect and growing affection. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Weston brought up an unexpected topic. "The Harvest Festival is coming up next month in town," he said. "Thought we might go, together." Josephine's heart skipped. The Harvest Festival was the biggest social event of the year in the territory. Going together would be a clear statement to everyone about their relationship. "Are you sure?" she asked. "People will talk." Weston shrugged. "Let them. I'm not ashamed of what's between us." Josephine thought about facing the townspeople who had stood silently as she was auctioned off. "Jenkins might be there," she said quietly. Weston's jaw tightened. "All the more reason for me to be at your side." In the end, they agreed to attend, and Josephine found herself looking forward to the outing despite her apprehension. She spent the following weeks preparing, sewing herself a new dress from fabric Weston had brought from town, baking pies for the festival's contests, and helping Weston select which of his cattle to bring for the livestock exhibition. The day of the festival dawned clear and cool, with the first hints of autumn coloring the landscape. Josephine dressed carefully in her new blue dress, which matched the ribbon Weston had given her. She pinned her hair up in a becoming style, leaving a few curls to frame her face, and added a touch of the lavender water to her wrists. When she came downstairs, Weston was waiting by the door, dressed in his best clothes, clean dark trousers, a pressed white shirt, and a vest that emphasized his broad shoulders. His hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaved. He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time. "You're beautiful," he said simply. Josephine blushed. "And you're very handsome." They rode into town in the wagon, Josephine's nerves growing as they approached. It had been months since she had set foot in Whisper Creek, and the memories of her humiliation were still fresh. The town square had been transformed for the festival, with colorful bunting hanging from buildings, stalls selling food and crafts, and a large area cleared for dancing later in the evening. Already, Families were gathering, children running excitedly between the attractions. As Weston helped her down from the wagon, Josephine was acutely aware of the stares and whispers that followed them. Some were curious, some disapproving, but she held her head high, drawing strength from Weston's solid presence beside her. They made their way through the festival, stopping to admire crafts and sample foods. Weston kept his hand at the small of her back, a quiet claim that wasn't lost on the townsfolk. Some of the women who had previously ignored Josephine now approached with forced smiles, clearly reassessing her now that she was on the arm of one of the territory's most successful ranchers. Mrs. Abernathy, the baker's wife who had shown kindness on the day of the auction, greeted them warmly. "Miss Reed, you're looking well. Life at Whispering Pines must agree with you." "It does," Josephine replied with a genuine smile. "And please call me Josephine." As they continued through the festival, Josephine delivered her pies to the judging table, where they were received with appreciative murmurs. Weston excused himself briefly to check on his cattle in the livestock area, leaving Josephine by the refreshment stand. She was sipping a cup of cider when a shadow fell across her. Looking up, she found herself face to face with Henry Jenkins. He was a large man with small, mean eyes and hands like hams. His breath reeked of whiskey despite the early hour. Well, he drawled, "if it ain't Reed's girl." "Heard you've been warming O'Malley's bed." Josephine straightened her spine, refusing to show fear. "Mr. Jenkins, I see you haven't changed." Jenkins leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper. "You still owe me a debt, girl. Your pa made a promise." "My father had no right to wager what wasn't his to lose," Josephine replied evenly, "and I owe you nothing." Jenkins grabbed her arm, his fingers digging painfully into her flesh. "You listen here. Take your hand off her." Weston's voice cut through the air like a whip. Jenkins turned, not releasing Josephine. "This ain't your business, O'Malley. This is between me and the girl." Weston stepped forward, his eyes cold with controlled fury. "I'm making it my business. Let her go. Now." Something in Weston's voice, or perhaps the set of his shoulders, ready for a fight, made Jenkins reconsider. He released Josephine's arm with a shove. "You paid good money for used goods, O'Malley," he sneered. "Hope she was worth it." Weston's fist connected with Jenkins's jaw before the larger man could react, sending him stumbling backward. The crowd around them drew back with gasps and exclamations. "Apologize to the lady," Weston demanded, his voice deadly quiet. Jenkins wiped blood from his lip, looking around at the gathering crowd. Several of the town's more respectable citizens were watching with disapproving expressions. The sheriff had started making his way toward the commotion. "Ain't worth the trouble," Jenkins muttered, backing away. "Keep her. She's probably frigid anyway." Weston took a step forward, but Josephine caught his arm. "Don't," she said quietly. "He's not worth it." The sheriff arrived, looking between the two men. "Problem here?" "No problem," Weston replied, his eyes still on Jenkins. "Mr. Jenkins was just leaving." The sheriff, who had been present at the auction months ago, looked at Josephine with something like shame in his eyes. "Miss Reed, good to see you looking well." Josephine nodded coolly. "Sheriff." After the lawman and Jenkins had moved away, Weston turned to Josephine, his expression concerned. "Are you all right? Did he hurt you?" She rubbed her arm where Jenkins's fingers had left red marks. "I'm fine, just shaken." Weston's jaw clenched as he looked at the marks. "We should go." "No," Josephine said firmly. "I won't let him chase me away. This is supposed to be a celebration, and I intend to celebrate." Weston studied her face, then nodded slowly. "If you're sure." "I am," she said, taking his arm. "Besides, I have a pie contest to win." As the day progressed, the incident with Jenkins faded into the background. Josephine's apple pie did indeed win first prize, much to her delight and Weston's pride. His cattle earned commendations from the judges at the livestock exhibition, and several ranchers approached him about breeding arrangements. As the sun began to set, lanterns were lit around the square and a small band set up on a platform. The dancing would soon begin. "Would you dance with me?" Weston asked as the musicians tuned their instruments. Josephine felt a flutter of nervousness. "It's been years since I danced." "I'm not much of a dancer myself," Weston admitted with a smile. "We can be awkward together." The band struck up a lively tune, and Weston led Josephine onto the dance floor. He was being modest, his movements were sure and confident as he guided her through the steps. Josephine quickly found the rhythm, memories of dancing lessons from her youth returning as they moved together. Other couples joined the floor, but Josephine was aware only of Weston, the warmth of his hand at her waist, the way his eyes never left her face, the smile that seemed reserved just for her. For the first time since the auction, she didn't feel the weight of the town's judgment. In Weston's arms, she was simply a woman dancing with the man she was coming to love. As the evening wore on, the band shifted to slower tunes. Weston drew Josephine closer, their bodies moving as one to the gentle melody. Around them, the world seemed to fade away. "I want to court you properly," Weston murmured against her ear. "Not as my employee, not because of any contract, but because you're the woman I want to build a life with." Josephine looked up at him, her heart full. "I'd like that very much." When they finally left the festival, stars were scattered across the night sky like diamonds on velvet. The ride home was quiet, both of them wrapped in the contentment of the evening despite the encounter with Jenkins. As they approached Whispering Pines, Josephine gazed at the silhouette of the house against the starlit sky. It truly was home now, in all the ways that mattered. "Penny for your thoughts," Weston said as he helped her down from the wagon. "I was just thinking how fortunate I am," she replied. "If you hadn't come to that auction," Weston's expression grew serious. "I believe some things are meant to be, Josephine. I wasn't planning to go to town that day. Something just pulled me there." He took her hands in his, "Like I was meant to find you." Under the vast Wyoming sky, with the scent of pine in the air and the soft sounds of night creatures all around them, Weston lowered his head and kissed her, not with the hesitant question of their first kiss, but with certainty and promise. As autumn painted the landscape in gold and crimson, Weston and Josephine fell into a new rhythm. Their courtship was unusual. They already lived under the same roof, already knew each other's habits and quirks, but Weston insisted on observing certain proprieties. He began taking Josephine on proper outings, picnics by the creek, rides to scenic overlooks, and occasionally, dinners at the hotel restaurant in town. These gestures touched Josephine deeply. After the festival, word had spread quickly about their relationship, and while some still whispered behind their hands, most accepted the situation. Josephine had proven herself at the festival. Her prize-winning pie and dignified behavior had gone a long way toward rehabilitation in the community's eyes. One crisp October afternoon, Weston announced he needed to make a trip to Cheyenne for supplies they couldn't get locally. "Would you like to come?" he asked as they cleared the breakfast dishes. "It's a 2-day journey each way, but there's a decent hotel. Separate rooms," he added hastily, his ears reddening slightly. Josephine smiled at his propriety. "I'd love to. I haven't been to Cheyenne in years." The trip was arranged for the following week, with Miguel and Alina agreeing to look after the ranch in their absence. Josephine packed carefully, including her blue dress for any special occasions. The journey to Cheyenne was pleasant, despite the bouncing of the wagon over rough trails. They traveled through stunning landscapes, the mountains rising majestically around them. At night, they camped under the stars, Weston making sure Josephine was comfortable in a tent while he slept outside by the fire. Cheyenne itself was a revelation to Josephine. Though not a large city by Eastern standards, it was bustling and modern compared to Whisper Creek, with proper hotels, restaurants, and shops. Weston secured them rooms at the Palmer House, a respectable establishment with clean, comfortable accommodations. "I have some business to attend to tomorrow morning," Weston told her as they dined in the hotel restaurant that evening. "But the afternoon is ours. Thought you might enjoy visiting the shops." Josephine nodded eagerly. I'd like that very much. The next morning, after breakfast, Weston left for his appointments while Josephine explored the hotel and its immediate surroundings. By the time he returned at midday, she was eager for their shopping expedition. The shops of Cheyenne offered luxuries Whisper Creek could only dream of. Josephine admired fine fabrics, elegant bonnets, and delicate glassware. Weston watched her with amusement as she lingered over a display of ribbons. "Choose whatever you like," he said. "Consider it a gift." Josephine hesitated. "You've already given me so much." "It pleases me to see you happy," he replied simply. In the end, she selected a green ribbon that complemented her eyes and a small bottle of rose-scented water. Weston insisted on adding a warm woolen shawl for the coming winter. Its soft folds a luxury against her skin. Their last stop was a bookshop, where Josephine lost herself among the shelves while Weston spoke with the proprietor. When it was time to leave, she reluctantly put back the volume of poetry she had been admiring. That evening, they dined at the finest restaurant in Cheyenne, the chandelier light glinting off crystal glasses and silver cutlery. Josephine wore her blue dress, and Weston had donned a formal suit that made him look even more handsome than usual. "You look beautiful tonight," he said as they were seated. "Though you're beautiful every day." Josephine blushed at the compliment. "And you look very dashing. I hardly recognize the rancher I know." Weston smiled. "Still the same man, just cleaner." The meal was exquisite tender roast beef, fresh vegetables prepared with butter and herbs, and a chocolate dessert that melted on the tongue. Throughout dinner, Weston seemed slightly distracted, his hand occasionally patting the pocket of his jacket as if checking that something was still there. As they finished their dessert, Weston cleared his throat. "Josephine, there's something I want to ask you." Her heart skipped a beat at his serious tone. "Yes. These past months, getting to know you, watching you make Whispering Pines into a true home, it's been the happiest time of my life." He reached across the table to take her hand. "I know your contract isn't up for a few more months, but I can't wait any longer to ask." Josephine's breath caught as Weston reached into his pocket and withdrew a small velvet box. Opening it, he revealed a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond. "Josephine Reed, would you do me the honor of becoming my wife? Not because of any contract or obligation, but because I hope you've come to care for me as deeply as I care for you." Tears welled in Josephine's eyes as she looked from the ring to Weston's face, open and vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "Yes, I will marry you, Weston O'Malley." Weston's face broke into a smile of such genuine joy that it took Josephine's breath away. He slipped the ring onto her finger, then raised her hand to his lips. "I love you, Josephine," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "I think I've loved you since that first day, when you stood so proudly despite everything." "And I love you," Josephine replied, the words feeling right and true. "Not for saving me, but for seeing me truly seeing me when no one else did." They returned to Whispering Pines as betrothed, their happiness evident to anyone who saw them. Alina wept with joy when they shared their news, while Miguel solemnly shook Weston's hand before breaking into a wide grin. The wedding was planned for December, before the worst of winter set in. Josephine threw herself into preparations, wanting their union to begin with proper celebration, despite the simplicity they both preferred. November brought the first snowfall, blanketing the ranch in pristine white. The beauty of it took Josephine's breath away as she stood on the porch, wrapped in her new shawl. "It's like a fairy tale," she said as Weston joined her, slipping an arm around her waist. "MMM," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Speaking of which, I have something for you." He led her back inside to the warmth of the fire and presented her with a parcel wrapped in brown paper. Inside was the volume of poetry she had admired in the Cheyenne bookshop. "How did you know?" she gasped, running her fingers over the embossed cover. Weston smiled. "I saw you looking at it. Went back the next morning while you were having breakfast." Josephine rose on tiptoe to kiss him, her heart full to bursting with love for this thoughtful man who noticed everything about her. As the wedding day approached, a letter arrived from Josephine's aunt in St. Louis, her mother's sister, whom she hadn't seen since childhood. Somehow, news of the upcoming marriage had reached her, and she wrote with congratulations and regrets that she couldn't attend due to her husband's ill health. "I didn't know you had family back east," Weston said as Josephine read the letter aloud. "Aunt Martha and I lost touch after Mother died," Josephine explained. "Father didn't approve of her city ways." She smiled sadly. "It's nice to know someone from my past cares enough to write." Weston squeezed her hand. "After we're married, perhaps we could visit her someday." The idea of traveling east with Weston, of introducing him to what little family she had left, warmed Josephine's heart. "I'd like that very much." The wedding day dawned clear and cold, the December sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Elena arrived early to help Josephine dress, bringing with her a veil of delicate lace that had been her own mother's. "For good luck," she said, carefully pinning it to Josephine's hair, which was arranged in soft curls. Josephine's dress was simple but elegant pale ivory satin that she had ordered from Cheyenne, with a fitted bodice and flowing skirt. Around her neck hung a small gold locket that had been her mother's, containing a tiny portrait of her parents on their wedding day. The ceremony was to take place in the small church in Whisper Creek, with a celebration afterward at the hotel. As Elena helped her into the wagon that would take them to town, Josephine felt a moment of panic. "What if no one comes?" she whispered. "What if they still think of me as that auction bride?" Elena patted her hand. "They will come, and if they don't, it is their loss. You will still be married to a good man who loves you." The church was already half full when they arrived. Josephine waited nervously in a side room, peering through a crack in the door as more townspeople filed in. To her surprise, many of the same people who had watched her humiliation at the auction now came to witness her wedding, dressed in their Sunday best. Mrs. Abernathy stopped by the room to wish her well, bringing with her a small posy of dried flowers to add to Josephine's bouquet. "For remembrance," she said with a warm smile, "and for new beginnings." Finally, it was time. As the church organ began to play, Elena gave Josephine's hand a final squeeze before slipping out to take her seat. Josephine took a deep breath, straightened her shoulders, and stepped into the doorway. The congregation rose as she appeared, but Josephine saw only Weston, standing at the altar with the minister. He was dressed in a new black suit, his hair neatly combed, his eyes finding hers immediately. The love and pride in his gaze gave her the courage to walk the length of the aisle, her head held high. When she reached him, Weston took her hand, his fingers warm and steady around hers. "You're breathtaking," he whispered as they turned to face the minister. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. They exchanged simple vows, promising to love, honor, and cherish one another for all their days. When Weston slipped the gold band onto her finger to join her engagement ring, his hands trembled slightly, the only outward sign of the emotion Josephine could see in his eyes. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister declared. "You may kiss your bride." Weston's kiss was gentle, but filled with promise, his hand cradling her face as if she were the most precious thing in his world. When they turned to face the congregation as Mr. and Mrs. O'Malley, Josephine was surprised to see genuine smiles on many faces. The celebration at the hotel was more joyful than Josephine had dared hope. The townspeople seemed to have collectively decided that her marriage to Weston legitimized her position in their society, and many who had previously ignored her now approached with congratulations and small gifts. Even Sheriff Collins made a point of coming to shake Weston's hand and offer Josephine his best wishes. "You found yourself a good man, Mrs. O'Malley," he said, his use of her new name causing a thrill to run through her. "And he found himself a fine woman." Notably absent was Henry Jenkins, a fact for which Josephine was grateful. She didn't want anything to mar the perfection of this day. As the celebration continued, Weston kept her close, his hand often finding hers or resting at the small of her back, no longer the protective gesture of a man shielding his employee, but the natural touch of a husband to his beloved wife. When it was time to leave, the guests lined up outside the hotel to shower them with rice and good wishes as they climbed into the decorated wagon. Weston had arranged for Miguel to drive them, allowing him to sit beside Josephine for the journey home. "Happy, Mrs. O'Malley?" he asked softly as they pulled away from the town. Josephine leaned against his shoulder, her heart full. "Happier than I ever thought possible." Back at Whispering Pines, now truly their home, Weston carried Josephine over the threshold as tradition demanded. The house had been prepared for their return, a fire blazed in the hearth, and the table was set with a cold supper and a bottle of champagne that Weston had secretly ordered from Cheyenne. Later, in the privacy of what was now their bedroom, all nervousness fell away in the face of their love for one another. Weston was gentle and patient, guiding Josephine through the discovery of physical love with the same care he had shown in all things. In the quiet aftermath, Josephine lay in his arms, watching the moonlight paint silver patterns on the ceiling through the window. "What are you thinking?" Weston asked, his fingers trailing lazily up and down her bare arm. "That I'm exactly where I'm meant to be," she replied, turning to look into his eyes. "That sometimes, fate has a way of bringing us to where we need to be, even through the darkest paths." Weston pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "I thank God every day that I rode into Whisper Creek when I did." "As do I," Josephine whispered, resting her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "As do I." Winter settled over Whispering Pines, blanketing the ranch in snow and forcing activities indoors. For Josephine and Weston, it was a time of profound contentment as they adjusted to married life. The days fell into a pleasant rhythm, Weston tending to the cattle and necessary outdoor chores, Josephine keeping the house warm and welcoming for his return. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, sometimes reading aloud to each other from Josephine's growing collection of books, sometimes simply talking about their days or their hopes for the future. Occasionally, Weston would take out his harmonica, a skill he had neglected to mention, until after they were married, and play simple tunes while Josephine mended or knitted. One such evening, in late January, as a blizzard raged outside, Josephine set aside her knitting with a thoughtful expression. "Weston," she began, "I've been thinking about what you said before about visiting my aunt in St. Louis someday." Weston looked up from the ranch accounts he had been reviewing. "Yes. What if we went in the spring, after the calving is done but before summer work begins in earnest?" Weston considered this, setting his pencil down. "It could be arranged. Miguel could watch the place for a week or two, but are you sure you want to make such a journey?" Josephine nodded. "I'd like to introduce you to Aunt Martha. And—" She hesitated, a blush coloring her cheeks. "I thought we might make it our delayed honeymoon trip." Weston's face broke into a smile. "I like that idea very much." He crossed to her chair and knelt beside it, taking her hands in his. "Is there something else?" "You have that look you get when you're not telling me everything." Josephine took a deep breath. "I think, that is, I'm fairly certain, we're going to have a baby." Weston's eyes widened, his hands tightening around hers. "A baby, are you sure?" She nodded, her eyes searching his face for his reaction. "I'm about 6 weeks late, and I've been feeling different. Alina says the signs are clear." For a moment, Weston remained frozen in place. Then, with a whoop of joy that startled Scout from his place by the fire, he lifted Josephine from her chair and spun her around. "A baby," he exclaimed, his face alight with happiness. "Our baby," Josephine laughed, dizzy from the spin and from relief at his reaction. "You're pleased, then?" Weston set her down gently, his hands moving to cradle her still flat stomach. "Pleased doesn't begin to describe it. I'm overwhelmed. Josephine, you've made me the happiest man alive, first by becoming my wife and now by giving me a child." He kissed her deeply, then pulled back with sudden concern. "Should you be resting? Do you need anything? I can ride for the doctor if you're not feeling well." Josephine placed a calming hand on his chest, amused by his sudden protectiveness. "I'm perfectly fine, Weston. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, but perhaps we should postpone the St. Louis trip until after the baby comes." Weston nodded thoughtfully. "That makes sense. We'll go next year when the baby is old enough to travel safely." The next months were filled with preparations for the coming child. Weston converted the small room adjacent to their bedroom into a nursery, building a cradle with his own hands from pine wood that he polished until it gleamed. Josephine sewed tiny garments and blankets, sometimes with Alina's help, laughing as the older woman shared stories of her own 5 children. As Josephine's body changed with the growing child, Weston's devotion only increased. He took on more of the household chores, insisted she rest frequently, and spent evenings reading aloud to both her and the baby, convinced that his child could already hear his voice. Spring brought new life to Whispering Pines calves in the pastures, buds on the trees, and wildflowers dotting the landscape. Josephine's belly grew round with their child, and her face glowed with the special radiance of expectant motherhood. In late May, as the first summer heat began to settle over the land, Josephine went into labor. The midwife was sent for, and Alina came to help, but it was Weston who refused to leave his wife's side despite the women's insistence that men traditionally waited elsewhere. "I'll not leave her," he said firmly, holding Josephine's hand as another contraction racked her body. "She needs me." Through the long hours of labor, Weston was her anchor, wiping her brow, supporting her back, murmuring encouragement when her strength began to flag. As dawn broke over the mountains, their daughter entered the world with a lusty cry that brought tears to her father's eyes. "She's perfect," Weston whispered, watching as the midwife cleaned and swaddled the infant before placing her in Josephine's arms. "Just like her mother." They named her Elizabeth Martha O'Malley Elizabeth for Weston's mother, and Martha for Josephine's aunt. She had Weston's blue eyes and a dusting of auburn hair that promised to be the same shade as Josephine's. The first weeks with Elizabeth were a blur of joy and exhaustion. Weston proved to be a devoted father, rising in the night to bring the baby to Josephine for feeding, changing diapers without complaint, and spending hours simply holding his daughter while Josephine rested. News of the birth spread quickly, and visitors came to offer congratulations and gifts. Even Mrs. Abernathy made the journey from town, bringing with her a beautiful christening gown that her own daughters had worn. By the time Elizabeth was a month old, life at Whispering Pines had settled into a new routine that revolved around the tiny person who had so completely captured her parents' hearts. One evening, as Josephine sat on the porch nursing Elizabeth while Weston smoked his pipe nearby, she found herself reflecting on the journey that had brought her to this moment. "A year ago today, I was standing on that auction block," she said softly, certain that my life was over. Weston set his pipe aside and moved to sit beside her on the swing, his arm going around her shoulders. "And I was riding into town with no idea that my future was waiting there." Josephine leaned against him, their daughter cradled between them. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't come that day, if you had taken a different road or arrived an hour later?" Weston was quiet for a moment, his eyes on their child. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but then I look at you and Elizabeth, and I know that couldn't have happened." "Some things are meant to be, Josephine. We were meant to find each other." "Even through an auction block?" she asked, a hint of old pain in her voice. "Even through that," he affirmed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "The path doesn't matter as much as where it leads." And ours led here to this home, to each other, to our daughter. Josephine looked out over the ranch that had become her home, at the life she had built with this good man who had claimed her when no one else would. The auction that had once been her greatest humiliation now seemed like a distant memory, the starting point of a journey that had brought her more happiness than she had ever thought possible. I love you, Weston O'Malley, she said, turning to meet his gaze. And I'm grateful every day that you pointed at me and said that one is mine. Weston's eyes crinkled at the corners as he smiled. Best decision I ever made, and I'll keep making it every day for the rest of our lives. As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the little family sat together on the porch of Whispering Pines Ranch, no longer a bride, and the cowboy who had claimed her, but partners in a love story that would continue to unfold for many years to come.